Welcome to the Allistair podcast, or welcome back to it. My guest on today's show is Paul Barnett. But before we get into this one, I just want to say a massive thanks to each and every one of you who have left a review or rating on iTunes or shared an episode on social media. I greatly appreciate it. For your reviews, this one coming from Mark Reynolds. Absolutely love the content and the discussions on the show. The flow and cadence from show to show is awesome. I've always at least one good takeaway from each episode. Keep up the work, Allistair. This is awesome stuff. Thank you so much, Mark. And of course, all of you who've taken the time to leave a review. Remember, you can also stand a chance of winning my book, Lead with Purpose, Make an Impact, by simply sharing one of the episodes from the Allistair McCall podcast. Already in the past 3 shows, we've had 3 winners of my book. Simply share an episode and include the hashtag Allistair McCall podcast. Moving on to today's show, my guest, as mentioned, is Paul Barnett. Paul is an Australian who lives in Romania, where he's the president of a brewery that is owned by the Japanese company Asahi. Now, interestingly, how I came across Paul was through his podcast, the Great Coaches Podcast, and it's definitely one of my favorite. But one of the main reasons why I wanted to get him onto the show was his experience in interviewing so many great coaches and also being a leader himself. Included in some of the questions I asked him during our chat was what he had learned from all those coaches he had interviewed on his podcast, where coaching ends and where leadership begins, as well as what were some of the other things that these great coaches have told him that have resonated with him the most. Now, what's really, really cool about this interview with Paul was that he was generous also to share some clips from his podcasts and from his shows of speaking to these great coaches. Just a side note, guys, is that this was recorded at the beginning of February before Russia invaded Ukraine. I thought I'd just add that as Romania is on the border of Ukraine. So let's get into it. This is Paul Barnett. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Allistair, and thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, I'm a massive fan of your podcast, the Great Coaches Podcast. It's something I listen to on my runs and in the gym and in my commute as well. So great job on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, this is what fascinates me, because obviously when I listen to a podcast, I want to look into the background of who the podcast host is, etc. And you know, listening to your podcast 1 or 2 times, I thought, man, this guy really knows his stuff. He knows his questions. He's the way he speaks to coaches, like he is a great coach himself. But you're an Australian who lives in Romania, where you are the president of a brewery that is owned by a Japanese company called Asahi. Hope I'm saying that correctly. And in your spare time, you run the Great Coaches Podcast. Imagine you're a busy person, so why does interviewing great sport coaches on the topic of leadership interest you so much?
Well, the short answer is I want to have better conversations with my wife and 2 daughters around the dinner table. But I feel like first I've got to tell you about TikTok. So living over here in Europe, 2 daughters, 11 and 15, and a couple of years ago when the pandemic started, we were desperately looking for some sun and we drove down to Croatia. And a couple of years ago, if you remember, TikTok was the craze. Kids were dancing everywhere. And I ended up having a conversation with my daughters about not being the star of the social media show, but, you know, taking a leadership approach and being not necessarily the person in front of the camera, but maybe being the person behind the camera. So they sort of looked at me, as kids do when you try to talk to them about stuff like that. We talked a little bit more about leadership over dinner. And then on the drive home, I was looking for a podcast on or about great coaches, because in my experience, great sporting coaches are some of the best leaders that I've experienced. There's something about their stoicism, their discipline, their acceptance of responsibility and their ability to motivate, that just resonates with me. I've experienced some great corporate leaders as well in Asia and in Europe and in Australia, but there's something about the qualities that great coaches have when it comes to leadership that sets them apart. I couldn't find a particular podcast that looked at just great coaches, so I got home and I started one. I did a little course, as you do. I asked my friend Jimmy to help me and get involved and be my partner on the project, and I sent off a few emails, and I guess many people were like me, sitting at home with some free time, and they were happy to talk. The conversations that came out of that, the learning was just so transformational in that time when we were all locked down. And there was some conversations, particularly with female coaches, that just connected with the family. In fact, there was one conversation with a lady in Australia called Penny Cooler-Reid who got told by the government she couldn't play with the boys anymore when she was 12. And she went on and basically changed the law. She's now a great coach in her own right, and her story really connected with my daughters. In fact, my little one went on. She entered a speech competition across the schools in Europe, and she won. And a large part of her speech was about Penny and Penny's influence on her and how it helped her become more of an activist and to stand up for equality. And so it's just really been a whirlwind of learning and better conversation around the dinner table. And in fact, I've got that clip from Penny to share with you now.
I think a lot of the time females can feel like it's tokenism to have a female a part of your coaching board or on the board of directors or in your organisation. And for me as a female trying to be authentic in what she does is that don't make us feel like we're there just for the sake of having us there. And I think that the more that females feel appreciated and the more that females feel that they actually do belong as the program leader, as a board director, as a coach, that the more we're going to get involved.
So what I'm hearing is that two passions of yours is definitely leadership, because you're in a leadership role within the brewery there, a very high position as well, and sports as well. So it's like a fusion for you.
Yeah, it is. I like the idea of trying to be a better leader, and I'm always looking for examples. And I think it's very important to look beyond your sphere of where you are. So I can look into the brewing world or the management world, the fast-moving consumer goods world, but there's more learning out there. And I think so many of these great coaches, these men and women from all countries, I've interviewed people from India and America and Finland and Australia and Ireland, and this global perspective has really opened my eyes, I think, to different ways of approaching the challenge that is leadership.
You know, I'm actually just looking through your guest list here on the Great Coaches podcast, and it's incredible. First of all, I know what it's like to run a podcast. I know how difficult it is to plan a show. In fact, I always say that a show takes you 7 times as much time as what the show is. So if it's an hour, it takes you 7 hours to prepare. And then, of course, trying to get the guest and the time zones, like you just mentioned there now, India, Australia, Europe, America, trying to coordinate all that. It's one heck of a job. I know it's very, very difficult. But, reeling off some of the names you've had here, for example, Frank Dick, you've had Gary Kirsten, so many names here. Gosh, Justin Langer, of course, who's been in the news lately as well with Australian cricket. Conor O'Shea, the Irish rugby fullback. Tasman Greenway from netball, Eddie Jones rugby. I mean, it's just it's like a superstar guest list.
I've been lucky. I think when I email people, I usually do it through LinkedIn, and I think people see this is an Australian guy running a brewery and he wants to talk to me about leadership. Well, I've got nothing else to do. Why not? So I think that helps. But I think look, I'm an expat and I moved countries last summer, and I don't have a lot of friends, and I also have a little bit of extra time on my hand as a result. So it's given me just some space to try and approach people. And I think if you approach people and you're genuine, they say yes.
Interesting.
I'm sure you found the same thing, Allistair. You've had you've had just as many wonderful coaches. And I'm sure you found the same thing when you approach people and you're authentic and you explain what you'd like to do.
Yeah, I think it's maybe been a little bit. I think it's maybe been a little bit more easier for me in a way because I've been in the sports industry. I've been around world-class sports for now 25 years. So you run into those people, and it becomes a very small world as well, where somebody knows another person, and so on and so forth. Or you meet people at events, for example. So, but you coming from a complete outsider point of view, that's why it fascinated me about the quality of your podcast. I love the simplicity of it, the questions you ask. And of course, your guest list as well speaks volumes as well. But here's my question to you. And actually, just getting back to that, you don't have a lot of friends. I mean, I know what it's like to live in a different country as well. But I did read something the other day that intelligent people have less friends. So there you go. Because maybe we don't stand for too much drama or BS. So maybe that's something.
Well, I have friends, and one or two of them will probably listen to this, but they're all elsewhere. They're all in another country. They're all scattered around the world. So I haven't made any yet in Romania, and I'm sure I will at some point.
So here's a question for you. You've dove into the sporting world, but what can the brewery industry teach us about leadership?
I moved country, as I said, last summer, June 21, and I came across to Romania. We have a big brewery here. It's called Ursus. It's the parent company's Asahi, the big Japanese brewer. We have about 1,700 people here. It's a big operation. And as I was preparing to come over, I really stopped and asked myself that same question: what learnings can I take from these great coaches into this new situation I found myself in, this sort of launch, if you like? And I think there was three, Allistair. There was three that I really reflect on. The first one was around caring. I have been surprised at the number of coaches that talk to me about the importance of care. In fact, I have this great voice grab that I'll share with you now from a famous Australian coach called David Parkin, who won many, many national championships in Australia, but was also an academic and wrote extensively on what sport could learn from the business world and vice versa. And he really unpacks this idea of care.
That, to me, is the greatest lesson I could give to coaches. If you care about your players beyond their capacity to produce the athletic performance which you are requiring and demanding of them, you will, in the first instance, get a better result performance-wise. But in the long term, you'll make a difference to this person for the rest of their lives. That, to me, is the greatest input and satisfaction that any coach should conceive. I love the fact that I can tell people I was a premiership coach, but it pales into insignificance now in comparison to the lovely conversations I've continued to have with my players. Not so much about their footy, that does come in, we have reunions, etc., but more about the lives that they've lived since.
I think, Allistair, the second thing I've found pertinent is this whole idea of behaviours. Many organisations, communities, corporations, sporting teams talk about values and the values of the organisation: innovation, commitment. They might talk about customer experience. There's many values which people aspire to, but coaches tend to talk more about behaviours, because behaviours are concrete and behaviours are the standards that will then go on and shape the environment of the team. And I've heard time and time again this whole idea of, standards become the behaviours you're willing to walk past. But what's really fascinated me too is the way that when new people join an organisation, they act or behave their way into the culture by looking at the standards around them. And I've been exceptionally attuned to this since I came to Romania and more aware of it than ever. And, Owen Eastwood has wrote this wonderful book called Belonging, and he talks too about the behaviours that you undertake to join a group and be part of a group. So I think this focus on behaviours and what is and isn't acceptable has been a really powerful learning for me as well. And I've got another soundbite that illustrates this, and it's from a guy called Paul Barnett, who was a very successful player, then transitioned and became a very successful coach, and now runs a very successful consulting business where he goes into organisations and talks to them about their culture.
If we're not conscious of our culture and we're not consciously working on our culture, then that 23-year-old can pick up some incredibly bad habits through that process. People yelling in a meeting, people being rude to each other, people not turning up on time. And then all of a sudden, what is that young person doing? Everyone wants to act their way into a culture. Or I want to feel valued. So I'm going, okay, at the end of the first week, well, no one was on time, so I'm going to be late because I don't want to be the first one here because that looks uncool. Everyone seems to yell at each other, so I better start yelling at each other, as opposed to we start off, the first meeting I walk into as a 23-year-old, everyone's on time. No one's on their phones. The meeting starts, we do a gratitude session at the start of the meeting, we do a shout out, who wants to give a shout out to someone in the room about someone who's done something really well, and then we get into the technical side of it. All right, he's watching. Oh, gee, that's interesting. There's 10 people in the room, they've rewarded 5 people for speaking up at last week's meeting. They've rewarded 4 people for being really diligent and delivering on their word and getting their work back. I just noticed that one person that they gave some constructive feedback took it really well and said, look, thanks very much, it won't happen again. Every interaction, do you see what I'm saying? If you're consciously working on your culture, then you will create a really good culture. What we talk about performance by design is we take the chance out of culture. I don't leave your culture to chance. We take the chance out of culture.
And the third thing, Allistair, I've learned is really this idea of joy or fun being fundamental to the learning process, and great coaches injecting fun and bringing fun into the whole ethos of their team, because it's a grind, daily excellence is a grind. And so this injection of fun as being a way to counteract that has been really, really something that's connected with me, particularly at the minute when we are trapped behind screens, we are disconnected from each other, and the fun has gone out of things a little bit. So I've been very focused on fun and joy and finding ways to inject them more into the corporate world. And I've got this great soundbite from Valerie Condis-Field, one of the most successful gymnastic coaches in the US, that illustrates how she's brought fun into her training. And she also talks about her time with Kobe Bryant and how he talked about fun and joy as well.
I believe I learned about the power of joy, bringing it into my coaching. When I started realizing it was important to develop relationships with my athletes is when the joy started being infused. And I'm not saying relationship as we're best friends, as we go out to lunch and shopping. That's for their friends to do. I'm talking about the relationship of I know them more than just as an athlete. So if we were in my office and I was asking them an open-ended question, how are you doing today? 99.9% of the time, the student athlete would respond about how she did in the gym. And I would say, if you want to talk about gymnastics, that's fine. I'll talk about you. That's not what I asked you, but I asked you about you. How are you as a human? The more those relationships developed in that sense, the more trust between the athlete and me there was. So when there was friction, when there was a disagreement, there was still this foundation of a relationship and trust, which is the biggest part of relationship. That's when I was able to help the athlete infuse joy into the process of learning. I had a wonderful one-on-one conversation for about an hour with Kobe Bryant. The majority of the talk, actually he started by saying, he said, Miss Val, I don't know whether to thank you or to be mad at you because my daughters have Caitlin Ohashi's floor routine, like automatic replay in our house. And he says, we literally have watched it probably 1,000 times. That switched to us discussing how important it is to infuse joy in the process of learning. And Kobe, we were just so on the same track that understanding that joy is not being happy. Joy is something internal that comes from you doing your absolute best at something. And he said to me, he says, Miss Val, joy for me was getting up every morning at 4:30 and putting in 2 extra workouts before the team ever showed up. He goes, I got so filled up with joy and pride that it really didn't even matter if we lost a game, our next game, that nobody can take that away from you. He said, that's my pride in a job well done is what filled me with joy that I was able to bring to everything I did in life.
Yeah, Valerie's great, isn't she? I had her on my podcast as well, and 30 years with UCLA gymnastics. What an incredible job. Also just was so open with the mistakes that she had made as well. So she was just a fantastic guest, as I'm sure she was for you as well. Getting back to what you said there about the standard you walk past is the standard you keep. And a good mutual friend of ours, someone that we've both had on our podcast, Ben Ryan, talks about that a lot. Is, he's very high on driving high standards. Of course, had a lot of success with the Fiji Sevens rugby team in the 2016 Olympics, winning gold as well. But what are some of the other things that these great coaches that you've interviewed, what have they told you that have resonated the most? You spoke about the commonalities there of care, behaviors, fun and joy. Anything else?
Resilience. And I think this has become a real focus for all of us during the pandemic. And the great coaches that I've interviewed break it down and talk about the 3 key things or activities that you can do to help build resilience. So the first is gratitude. So expressing gratitude on a daily basis for something that someone has done. The second thing is selflessness. So I'll often talk to the team about, what are you going to do in this meeting today to help someone else? What are you going to do this week? What act are you going to do this week to help somebody else within the group? So selflessness. And the third thing quite surprised me when it came to resilience. I'm often quite a big believer of, I don't like internal competition. When I see an individual looking for praise or recognition, I usually think it's a sign of a dysfunctional team. And there is enough competition outside for us to focus on rather than looking at it internally.
But my thinking on that's been challenged because small competitions within the group help normalise competitiveness and help build resilience.
So those 3 things have connected with me a lot, and I've tried to factor those into what I do daily. And then there's the small things like, I had a really interesting coach called Paul Barnett talk to me about round tables. And he said, a round table takes the power positions away and makes everybody equal. And I went off and tried it, and Paul's exactly right. It just changes the dynamic in a team discussion. And I think as a leader in a group, you're trying always to foster psychological safety, which really means people feel free to speak without fear of retribution. They can put their idea out there
and no one's going to criticise or belittle them for it.
And as the leader, what you want is the more broad and varied the opinions you're getting from the people around you, the better the quality of the decision-making and the quicker the decision-making.
And I found that a round table just helped facilitate that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something when I spoke to Phil Neville, the former Manchester United football player, and now he's managing down here in Inter Miami. He spoke about that Sir Alex Ferguson, when you were called to his office, of course, you said you feel like a schoolboy going into Sir Alex's office. And you'd either have his office table for the more serious discussions across the table, the negotiation, the contract type of things. And then you'd have a round table in the corner of the office where you'd sit around and discuss more, if we can just call it lighthearted type of things, or maybe somewhere where you wanted to show his care or show some vulnerability, for example. So very, very interesting that you brought that up about the psychology of tables, square and round. Now, one of the main reasons why I wrote Lead with Purpose, Make an Impact, my book, and this is not a push for my book here by any means, but it was the fact that people, that when you're a coach, because there's going to be a lot of coaches listening to this right now, is that you automatically think that you're a leader, that the title allows you to lead others. But we know that coaching and is a completely different skill to leadership. Now, coaching, you might know strategy, you might know your X's and O's, as we say here in the United States. You might know game plan, etc., but you don't know how to lead people. So my question to you is, where do you think coaching ends and leadership begins in that respect?
This is an interesting one, because I'm going to
differ from you a little bit and challenge you a little bit on this one. Maybe between us we can work it out. So we do leadership training, as many corporations do, and the leadership models that a lot of companies use come down to Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman was a psychologist from America who popularized the term emotional intelligence, and he's written many, many books, and he's a wonderful read, and he's very, very good. And he has a leadership model where he breaks apart the different styles. There's visionary leadership, there's a commanding type of leadership, there's a facilitative style, there's a pace-setting style, where the leader works so hard thinking everyone will follow, and there's a coaching style. So I believe that coaching is a form of leadership, and I think it's becoming a more and more effective type of leadership as the generations change. And each of those types of leadership is required in a certain situation. You might be in a business that's a startup. People might be listening that are in startups, and they're in visionary mode. They're trying to imagine a future. They're trying to create that future and motivate a group of people to move towards it. But then you might be in a traditional business like mine. Brewing's been around for thousands of years, but it's got its own challenges. And so you're trying to unlock energy. You're trying to empower people. And I think a coaching style can work there. And I think this coaching style is becoming more and more prevalent. I was interviewing Eddie Jones, and he alluded to this change in his own style and how he now works with the players very differently from perhaps the way he did many, many years ago. And I've got this voice grab that illustrates this change in Eddie.
Rather than trying to solve a player's problem, we'll give the player almost the problem entirely and encourage them to work out the problem. Now, we'll give them advice and guidance, but the problem is their problem, not our problem. So if, say a player's got a problem with his consistency of his performance, traditionally a coach would be trying to find ways to help him be more consistent. Now, we certainly take the approach, well, you're inconsistent. How are you going to solve it? Now, if you need some help, we can help you, but that's your problem because ultimately you're going to make the choice, not us. We're not going to make the choice for you. You're going to make the choice.
I'm going to challenge you back here, Paul, because I love this discussion right now about, coaching and leadership. I have witnessed, in 25 years being around sports programs, and those are from, elementary school to recreational, college, professional, where I've seen great coaches again who know their X's and O's. They've had a lot of experience. They've maybe been top level athletes themselves, but they lack those leadership skills. And this is why I'm saying is that I find in the coaching industry, there's a lot of coaches who just believe that they're leaders because they're a coach, because they see over 20 players or 50 athletes or whatever it may be. And they lack those interpersonal skills. They lack those skills that you just mentioned there now. And this is another thing, is that great coaches adapt. You spoke about Eddie Jones, the conversations I've had with Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski, how he's adapted over his 42 years, for example. And I just feel there's still those leadership qualities that a lot of coaches lack. Where, in your opinion, where are some of the areas that coaches can learn from corporate leaders, business leaders like yourself?
The area I find most surprising, actually, when I listen to coaches talk, is they'll often talk about the business world and they'll say, oh, they don't measure culture. Culture for them is something that's secondary to the balance sheet. Couldn't be further from the truth. Mm. We have a cultural survey that comes out every year. We survey every person in the company. It's consistently done over time, so you can track how you're traveling. It gets into behaviors, standards, vision, management, controls. It unpacks everything by department, and it allows you to look into the business and see where you need to strengthen and see where you need to change and go forward. And so I think getting under the skin of culture and looking at it from a continuity point of view, from a long-term point of view, is something that coaches and their organisations can learn from the corporate world. One of our breweries here in Romania is over 300 years old. Now, you go into a business that's 300 years old, it's doing something right. It's got a culture that is thriving to allow it to survive that time. So you need to get under the skin of figure out what that is and keep pushing it forward. There are not many sporting teams in the world at the elite level that are older than, 150 years at most? And yet some businesses have been around for longer than that. Some haven't, some fail and they evolve and they become something else. But this continuity of culture, I think, is something that's very important. And it gets back to this whole idea, I think, of let's call it coaching, because these businesses have evolved, and they didn't evolve because of one all-powerful leader that came in and said, this is the way we're going to go. They succeeded because small groups of people were empowered to go ahead and make change that had lasting impact. And empowering people and getting to the heart of unlocking that energy, I believe it's a coaching approach. Asking good questions, challenging people is very difficult to do when you're in an environment where you've got a do or die match or the results from the monthly P&L coming at you. It's very difficult. You know, I listen to these coaches talk about the power and importance of the locker room and how the locker room is, you know, where the essence of the hard, real conversations come from. Well, that's the boardroom as well. You're in the boardroom. If you're sitting around a board table, you need to be contributing to a conversation outside of your area of specialty. So if you've got your sales VP there, they need to be talking about the financial strategy for the company. Just as in the locker room, I imagine the defensive unit team needs to be talking about the overall game strategy and the culture of the team. So there are similarities in the way that both sets of organisations approach high performance. And a lot of it comes down to challenging conversations with a small group of people about long-term success.
Before we move on to my next question, I want to quote, I love this quote, and it gets back to the coaching and leadership thing. It's from Gary Curneen. Gary is a football coach here he's working here in the United States. He's from Northern Ireland, actually, where I was born. I was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I know I've lost the accent, but Gary said this. He said, today, coaching skills are accelerating towards leadership skills more than the simple X's and O's. Less directing, more facilitating, less ego, more humility and empathy.
Yeah,
would you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. I mean, strategy, whether it's X's and O's, sounds like tactics to me, and strategy is more about, well, what players are we going to recruit, what kind of game style do we want, and so forth. I mean, tactics, you make money on your execution and you win games on your tactics, but you build organizations for the long term on your strategy. And I think that's where coaching comes in.
Paul, throughout all your interviews with the coaches and leaders on your podcast, have you heard anything that you didn't necessarily agree with?
You know, Allistair, when I listen to these great coaches talk, I hear them talk about this focus, and I know you've been an elite level athlete yourself and also an elite level coach. The focus and dedication required just sounds so one-dimensional. And I think you miss a little bit of the breadth and flavour that life has to offer. I've been lucky enough to be an expat. I was born in England. My parents moved us to Australia for a better life, and I've travelled to
better
40
weather,
different countries for work, better weather. But I love this idea of exposure to a wide array of things to make you a better leader. And I think this one-dimensional nature of the life of a great coach and even athlete, it doesn't really connect with me.
What's one thing someone could do today with the wisdom shared from the great coaches you have interviewed?
I'd probably go back to resilience, as we talked about before. I would get up tomorrow. I would express gratitude to the family. I would do something selfless through the day, and I would get involved in some kind of mini competition, whether it's football tipping or, whatever it is. That's what I would do. That's one thing I would do. I think the second thing that I'd recommend is you need to reframe your thinking about failure. I see so many people I interact with, not just at work, in life, who become paralyzed through this fear of failure. Like they feel that if I try and I fail, it won't be great, so I won't try. Whereas I think great coaches take this view on life. They'll just experiment. I'll try this experiment. I'll see what happens. I'll take a learning. oh, I'll try another experiment. I'll see what happens. I'll take learning. So they almost are like doing these small experiments every day. And the cumulative effect is they're always learning. It's a very different mindset from a lot of people that I think all of us can get caught up in this quest for perfection. And it stops us, conversely, from actually trying new things, from actually experimenting, and being comfortable with failure. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a friend the other week, and we were chatting, and he's always pushed for time. This friend of mine, he's always got an agenda, wants to get through the agenda. And I said to him, just take a deep breath and meet people where they are. I interviewed Jen Busek, one of the first females to coach in the NBA in America. And she was like, just meet people where they are. Take a deep breath, figure out where they are and build from there. Such a powerful idea. So we this friend of mine, who I won't name, we did it as an experiment. He had it as an experiment for a week. And he came back at the end of the week and he said, I feel so much more relaxed. I had one really deep quality conversation with someone, but it took a lot of cognitive effort. Good. That's an experiment. Try something else next week.
Paul, this has been a great conversation, and I know you're a busy man. You're running a brewery there. You're running a company there, but just one or two more questions. And I ask all my guests this question on the Allistair McCall podcast. Now, there's two questions in one here. How do you define success in your career as a leader? And the second part of that is in your life. How do you define success for your life?
So I think, how would I answer this one? So as a leader, my fundamental role is to improve the well-being of the group, full stop. And when you unpack the word well-being, it can mean many things. It can mean the financial health of the business. It can mean the mental health of the employees. It could mean the sense of belonging and the culture of the organisation. And we measure a lot of those things. So I get feedback. I get a scorecard. So whether or not I'm improving the well-being of the group is the fundamental thing I focus on as a leader. So the second part of the question was, how do I measure success in my life? My wife and daughters and I, we have a little family mission. We do these little 5-year plans. And our mission at the minute is great moments together. Not perfect. Great is good enough. Not hours and hours, just moments. So it might be 10 minutes together around the dinner table. It might be 5 minutes together in the morning eating breakfast together. So I measure success for myself as an individual on whether I'm doing the best job I can to help the family have great moments together. It's hard, Allistair, right? Everyone knows how hard it is to have great moments with your family, how hard it is to have great moments with your friends. But I think it's worth pursuing, and I'm not great at it by any means, but we try as a family. And I think even having a conversation these days is getting harder and harder. People are distracted by phones and life. So great moments together is the barometer for personal, and at work, it's my ability to improve the well-being of the group.
I love that. In fact, I have my 10 rules of success that I made for myself a few years ago, and rule number 10 is appreciate the moments. And I think you might be more or less the same age range as me. I don't know, maybe a few years younger than me. But once you get into your 40s, you start to realize how quickly life goes by.
I'm 48. I'm not in as good condition as you are. I'm happy to say that I'm trying. But you, Allistair, I'm not a big. I do have a social media presence, but I was telling you I'm not on there every day. I don't have any social media on my phone either. So I pop on for 10, 15 minutes in the evening on the laptop. And you wrote something a few months ago that really connected with me. And actually, it was on one of the lists that you put together. And at the end of it, you said, how would this meeting or this session today go if everybody else had your attitude that you have right now? And it just really connected with me. And I went into the boardroom and I used it. we always have a minute of reflection before we start. What does everyone want to give and get from this meeting? What was the highlight of the week? There's always something we begin with. And I asked this question, and it was a really confronting question because we come into the room distracted with the wrong energy or not the right energy or carrying energy from somewhere else. And I thought it was a really profound question. So thank you for that.
You're most welcome. Yeah, it is. It's one of my favorite as well. If everybody in this school, this organization, this church, this business, it can be anything. This house had your attitude. What kind of culture would we have, or what kind of environment would we have? It's such a powerful statement. So, final question, Paul.
Okay.
We were just talking about age as well, so nothing relatable there. You're lying on your deathbed many, many years from now. I just have to put that in there, hopefully for me as well. What are 3 bits of advice or wisdom you would like to leave with the world?
Well, look, let's break it down. So my little life motto is, we've all got life mottos. The one I use a lot is, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much room. So that's probably one. The second one is the one I use with the girls a lot, which is be calm, this moment will pass. To the point where they mock my voice when they say, "Oh, Daddy just wants."
It's from the Bible, that isn't it, Paul? This too shall pass.
It's also in the Buddhist Bible where they talk about impermanence. I think it's just one of these common beliefs, and we get caught up in failure and anxiety and stress when we're younger. But you know what? Be calm. The moment will pass. And the third one, I'm going to pick a work one. So the thing I say the most at work is something I picked up from a mentor who I think paraphrased it from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's this. It's not the situation you find yourself in that matters, but the way you choose to respond to it that counts. And so, I'll often talk at work about, and there's some kind of issue, there's a problem. There's always problems, but there's not always the right response. People react sometimes and they get themselves in an awful state, when really, take a deep breath and let's respond, not react, in a way that, as I've said, keeps these breweries going for another 300 years.
Love it. So not taking up too much space. That's an important one. Live on the edge. This too shall pass. This moment will pass. I love that one because we can sometimes be just sitting on something that we worry about for far too long. So fantastic, Paul. As expected, it's been a fantastic conversation. I could go on for another hour with you here. I think we've got to make it part 2 in the future sometime. But thank you so much for coming onto the podcast as well, and also thank you. I want to acknowledge you for what you give us as coaches and leaders as well through your podcast, the Great Coaches Podcast. I know you're not a big social media guy. You are on Twitter, I believe. Are you on Instagram?
We've got a little Instagram and a Twitter, but I must admit I'm just not a big social media person. But I want to jump in before you finish and say thank you to you too, Allistair. I have I give myself every day, towards the end of the workday, I give myself 10, 15 minutes where I might have a look at Twitter. And you seem to be often on at about 6 p.m. Romanian time, which must be your morning. And I just really enjoy the authenticity, the realness of some of the stuff you put out there. And it gives me a moment to sort of stare out the window and reflect. And, I appreciate that. And it's not everyone that can sort of conjure that kind of moment. So thank you for my great little moment every evening.
No, coming from you, I appreciate that a lot. So, Paul, thanks so much.
Thanks, Allistair. Take care.
So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one with Paul Barnett. As mentioned at the beginning of the show, you could win my book, Lead with Purpose, Make an Impact, by simply sharing this episode or any others on the Allistair McCall podcast. Also, check out some of the free courses I have available on my website, allistairmccaw.com. on my homepage, you'll see on the menu the word more. Simply press that and then press courses. So until next time, keep making an impact.